Sweat drifted from Apple Bloom's upper brow, down her muzzle, and onto the soil of the apple orchard as she went about her daily work out in the field. Her muscles ached, and the sun's heat beat at her with a violent radiance as the luminous orb continued to shine high in the sky. While she took on the eastern part of the massive apple orchard, her older siblings tackled the western areas of the landscape of trees and apples. The western parts were composed of more old and rigid trees, while the eastern trees were more younger and less rigid, something Apple Bloom normally had no problem with. But as she had grown into a teenager, she had developed quite the anticipation for helping her beloved siblings in the western parts of the orchard. Her anticipation was shot down though, seeing the answer had always been a definitive no. However, the first time she had asked was at a much younger age than now, so she figured that maybe Applejack had a point. But over time, her assumption had grown into more of a frustration and curiosity. She was now 14 years old, stronger, smarter, and even more persistent than when she was a filly, searching for her place in Equestria. She certainly was strong enough now, but still, the answer hadn't changed the slightest. Each attempt always ended in the same two-letter word she had grown to hate. Just the very slightest mutter of it made her grind her teeth in irritation, quickly following a blood-red face. Her latest attempt to sway her older sister had been somewhat different, being less of a straight answer and more of an actual conversation explaining why she was considered unworthy. Applejack had explained that she lacked the strength to cause a force strong enough to knock the apples down from the ancient trees, but Apple Bloom knew that Applejack was only making an excuse. She knew her sister too well, and knew that Applejack's duties as the older sibling were clouding her ability to see that Apple Bloom was no longer the filly she thought she was. Apple Bloom knew all too well that was the reason, but getting Applejack to realize that was far from simple. Applejack was as stubborn as a wild mule, and her actions during one specific apple-bucking season proved that statement true. It was only when she was given no choice that Applejack had finally swallowed her pride and accepted the help she needed to get the job done. Apple Bloom had thought hard multiple times on some way to replicate those events all those years ago, but everything she had tried had failed. No matter how much she had tried to show that she was now grown up, both Applejack and Big Mac had not even been swayed the slightest in return. Thinking about it, along with a mixture of the intense heat, sweat, and fatigue, caused Apple Bloom to express her irritation and annoyance with a violent kick to the base of one of the many trees she had been assigned. The rounded crimson apples fell like stones from the tree's branches into the many buckets below, following a culmination of thuds from the sweet fruits colliding against one another at the impact of the fall. Once the younger tree's branches were bald and ridden of any apples, she carried each bucket separately from the tree base to a provided wagon that would be taken back to the farmhouse by Big Mac later on, after work in the orchard was done. Apple Bloom would agree that she wasn't strong enough to carry a loaded wagon, but she wasn't fraying from her theory of being ready for the more challenging trees in the orchard, and she was going to prove it. After working for 3 hours straight, the familiar sound of a cowbell rang from the farmhouse, not far from where either she or her siblings were working in the mass of apple trees for what seemed like miles. Apple Bloom smiled, knowing what the ringing of the cowbell meant, her stomach grumbling at the sound. It was lunchtime, which meant 1 hour out of the heat and relaxation. Carefully and steadily, Apple Bloom made her way out of the large orchard back to the farmhouse. Upon arrival, she was greeted by her elderly grandmare and a set table. 4 plates were placed in front of 4 separate chairs, daffodil and daisy sandwiches presented on each plate, along with apple juice as a beverage. Taking a seat, Apple Bloom quickly dived into her meal, taking a large bite out of her sandwich and washing it down with a swig of her provided apple juice. It wasn't long before her siblings joined the company of herself and Granny Smith, taking a moment to bathe in the shade and catch their breath. Both of them were drenched in sweat, walking somewhat unsteady from a mixture of the heat and the exhaustion of work.
Wait! All that hard work sure builds up an appetite.
Taking their seats, both proceeded to grabbing their own provided sandwiches and separate beverages, sitting across from their youngest sibling. Applejack ate slowly and steadily, while Big Mac, having a much larger tolerance for food, engulfed his first sandwich. Granny Smith had already been a step ahead of things and had prepared an additional sandwich for the robust stallion. Big Mac grabbed the sandwich and proceeded to devouring it, while both Applejack and Applebloom continued to nibble at their own sandwiches.
Sure is a hot one today. Them trees are as healthy as a blooming flower on the morning of spring. I had to put extra effort into bucking the apples off the branches. Nevertheless, the apples should be as sweet as a honeysuckle. It's going to be a great harvest this year.
Yep.
Applejack took another small bite out of her sandwich, while Applebloom swallowed her current mouthful, rolling her eyes. She had taken Applejack's previous statement less as a positive one, but more as a burn. While the fact that the trees were healthy was a reassurance that they wouldn't have to worry about Filthy Rich hounding them, the fact it involved the one area of the orchard Applebloom was forbidden to work in made it seem more like an insult in her ears. Applejack caught Applebloom rolling her eyes, causing her to become confused. She quickly swallowed her food, then turned her gaze to Applebloom, who just sat back in her chair, expressing a fake smile that Applejack saw through without a second thought.
What's got your tail in a bunch, Applebloom?
Applebloom raised her eyes at the mentioning of her name, continuing to hold that same fake smile, hoping that Applejack would buy it. She wasn't even convinced by it. Seeing that her current tactic wasn't working, Applebloom just responded with a tone that came out as a mild anger, but slowly grew more and more as she went on.
Oh, I don't know, Applejack. Why don't you keep on bragging on and on about the one part of the orchard that you know I've been asking about for the past countless years?
Applebloom begun, capitalizing her words with a glare that stung Applejack like a hornet. Applejack immediately knew what Applebloom was referring to, having dealt with this endeavor more than once.
I already told you why you can't, Applebloom. It's because
Because you're too young and young hooves aren't strong enough to take on those trees. I know. I've heard that same speech too many times to count.
She quickly followed by planting one hoof hard on the table, having grown tired of hearing that same speech.
I've been bucking these trees just as long as you and Big Mac. I'll know where to hit, where the baskets need to be placed to catch the apples, and where to take them after. I'm not a baby anymore, Applejack. I'm older and stronger now. I'm ready. I know I am.
The sudden outburst made the table grow quiet and had made all of the ponies present jump in surprise. Applebloom's face had grown so red that it could have mirrored a red apple itself, and her eyes were teary and bulged, nearly to the size of the plate in front of her. It took a moment for the storm to clear at the picnic table. The unbelievable amount of unease and pressure at the table had caused a momentary pause. No pony moved. No pony spoke. No pony breathed. All except Applebloom, who had slumped back into her seat with her front legs crossed in a fit of anger. Applejack had seen her younger sister angry before, but never had she seen her this upset. In all the years of Applebloom's silly and reckless tactics to get her cutie mark, she had never gotten this upset, and that was saying something. Applebloom broke the silence again.
Y'all have been holding me back because you think I'm too young and weak. those trees, and while I appreciate your concern, I'm not a baby anymore.
Apple Bloom, that's not what we think.
Is it? You've been treating me like a baby even after I got my cutie mark. You know, and I know full well that I've been ready for years, Applejack. So prove that you don't think I'm a baby, and give me a chance to prove it.
Applejack froze. Apple Bloom had hit the nail right on the head, and there was nothing she could say in retort, knowing whatever followed would be a lie. She took a moment to think heavily about Apple Bloom's words, until she finally realized that she had indeed been holding her younger sibling back from even having a chance to prove herself, her sisterly instincts being the culprit. Knowing Apple Bloom was right, she decided to sympathize with the Crusader, giving her a smile of reassurance.
You really think you're ready?
More than ready.
Applejack stood up from her seat and walked around to where Apple Bloom sat. The young Crusader wasn't sure about what was going on, so she just sat motionless. Applejack followed by putting out one of her hooves, holding it out to Apple Bloom.
Alright, then let's see for sure if you are. Come on. I'll take you to the tree I was chosen to prove my worth on.
Apple Bloom paused, her expression falling from angry to happy with a small hint of confusion.
Are you serious?
You're right. I've been holding you back for some time now, and I apologize for not seeing that sooner. So, as a way to make up for it, I'm going to give you a chance to prove if you're ready or not for the task.
Applejack confessed, holding her Stetson to her chest. Apple Bloom smiled, trying her hardest not to sprint in excitement that at long last she had gotten it through her sister's head that she had not even been giving her a chance. At the sound of Applejack's last statement, though, a slight tinge of curiosity developed in Apple Bloom's head.
Last call for Apple Bloom to the apple orchard.
Applejack mimicked, causing Apple Bloom to giggle in her slight daze of happiness, unsure whether or not this was a dream. Shaking her head and breaking from the daze, Apple Bloom took Applejack's hoof in hers, and as sisters, hoof and hoof, took their leave from the farmhouse, deep into the apple orchard. The trot into the orchard seemed like hours for Apple Bloom, when in reality, it had only been about 20 minutes or so. The area the two had traveled into was much more shaded, and to Apple Bloom, seemed slightly eerie, unlike any other area she was usually accustomed to working in. The trees seemed more desolate, moist, and in some way alive. It made her feel uneasy and jumpy at the slightest sound. In an attempt to ease her nerves, Apple Bloom tucked closer to her sister, feeling as if she were being watched amongst the desolate region by unseen eyes. It was as if she were being spectated on a stage in the heart of a spotlight. A feeling she didn't like, given the circumstances. Applejack noticed this and stopped. She had expected this, seeing she had done the same thing when she too was taken by Granny Smith to the same tree to be tested all those years ago. She turned back to her younger sibling. Her face was pale, her body was shaking in fear, and her eyes expressed unease and terror. Applejack planted her rear on the ground, facing Apple Bloom with a smile. Apple Bloom raised her head to meet Applejack's gaze, her eyes full of warmth and reassurance, as she too planted her rear on the ground.
I'm sorry, Applejack.
You ain't got nothing to be sorry for. It's okay to be afraid. I was the same exact way when Granny took me.
Apple Bloom raised an eyebrow, unsure of how to feel.
Really?
Applejack responded by nodding her head.
I was scared out of my wits, but Granny assured me that it was okay to be afraid. After all, it was somewhere I'd never been before. Therefore, any young'un would be terrified of the unknown.
Applejack's words caused Applebloom to slowly feel better and reassured. A smile slowly began to form, feeling Applejack put a hoof on her shoulder.
If you start to get scared, just say something and we'll stop, alright?
Alright, I will.
Applebloom answered, doing her best to smile in the midst of the unknown. Applejack smiled back and kissed her sister on the forehead, turning back in the direction of wherever they were going. Applebloom took her sister's words to heart and swallowed any sort of fear or doubt into the pit of her stomach. However, despite her attempts of ridding herself of her fear, her sense of paranoia and unease remained as they trotted deeper and deeper into the orchard. Passing the many apple trees, Applebloom noticed that their branches were bald of any fruit. She quickly assumed that the trees had just been bucked earlier, but her mind said otherwise, seeing it had taken a long while to get this far, and if Applejack and Big Mac worked out in this area, they would have taken longer to get back to the barn. That is, if they could have even heard the cowbell from this far out. Applebloom found herself constantly turning her head at the smallest sound, from a twig being snapped to the creaking of the tree branches, which at times sounded as if the trees were speaking to each other, judging her on why she was out here. It had been an hour by now, and the young crusader had become slightly scared once again, tempting her to stop Applejack again. But she wanted to show her sister that she was strong, so she just did her best to ignore her fears. The farmhouse was no longer within view, and the area had become remote and alien. Never had Applebloom imagined that their orchard expanded this far, nor that area like this existed. Applebloom couldn't explain it, but everything about this place seemed unusual and somewhat unnatural. Even the dirt felt different. Along with that, she swore that she could feel the ground move in the rhythm of a regular heartbeat beneath her hooves, but assumed that to only be her own heartbeat, hearing it reverberate in her ears and pound in her chest. Every fiber of her being was telling her to not proceed any further, but she didn't want to disappoint her big sister, so she just kept her chin high and her poker face as blank as a stone. However, her fear never dissipated. She wanted to run away from this place, go back to the farmhouse and join her grandmare and brother for lunch. Be anywhere but wherever in Celestia's name she was now.
How much farther is this train, Applejack?
Not much further, Applebloom. Be patient, little sis. Trust me, it'll be worth the trip.
Silence followed. They walked another 2 miles, or at least that's what Applebloom estimated, until they finally came to a stop in front of a tall and wide tree, massive in size. It had no top due to it being too tall to see where its very top came to an end. At its base were imprints of back hooves embedded into the ancient wood. Applebloom stood stunned at the sight, immediately noticing something about the tree that was different from the other surrounding trees. The most obvious was the color of its branches. Unlike the other trees whose branches were brown, the branches of this tree were black. Not to mention that the longer Applebloom examined the branches, they didn't seem like regular branches, more like tendrils laced with some sort of white, hair-like draping. The one specific thing about the tree that made Applebloom shudder, though, was the fact that she had never seen the tree before, and its size should have made it stick out like a sore hoof. Something about it made Applebloom quiver as she watched her sister approach the tree's base.
This here is the oldest tree ever planted in the orchard. It's been here since before Equestria was ever founded, and Granny Smith, along with the other settlers, found Ponyville.
Many questions sprouted in Applebloom's mind immediately, along with the cold shiver that slowly slithered from her neck to her flank, bringing a sense of discomfort with it. She wanted to move, but was frozen in place, unable to speak or turn her sight away from the tree.
This is where all the ponies who ever had a hoof in creating this massive landscape of apple trees were initiated into the task of caring for the oldest trees. It's a task for only the strong and willing, not for the weak and unwilling. If you are able to leave an imprint on the most ancient tree to ever be planted on these grounds, you are ready to take on the task, as only those with the strongest of hooves can handle the job. If you shall fail, then you will never be ready. The tree only judges you once. There are no second chances. I'll only ask once. Do you truly think you are ready, Applebloom?
Applebloom took a moment to absorb and analyze the words fully. She only had one chance to prove her worth? Had Applejack and Big Mac done this initiation as well and succeeded? One look at the tree answered her question, seeing 2 pairs of hooves that matched those of her big brother and sister. She pondered on maybe waiting a few more years, seeing the confidence she had originally had disappeared. Only when she was read the conditions and given the yes or no question that she didn't expect, did she realize just what she was getting herself into. Was she truly ready to care for the older trees? She honestly didn't know, seeing the pressure of the situation was clouding her judgment. She thought quickly, thinking about what would happen if she didn't try. She would have come all this way for nothing, and would probably shame herself for not even trying in the aftermath. She could wait longer, but in that moment, that seemed like an option that made her look weak to her entire family. She was an apple. Apple bucking was in her blood. And if she failed, no, she wouldn't fail. Despite the creepy atmosphere, the many questions she had, and all of her senses screaming at her to get out of there, Applebloom's pride made it all seem like nothing but excuses not to even try.
I'm ready.
Applejack smiled, gesturing Applebloom to join her at the base of the ancient tree. Applebloom did as her sister directed, and walked until she was at her sister's side, smiling herself.
Then pick a spot and buck the tree with every bit of your might. Remember, the tree only judges you once, so you only have one chance to prove yourself worthy. Don't hold back any bit of anything. Give it your all.
With that last statement said, Applejack moved away from the tree, standing in front of Applebloom with a look of assurance. There was no turning back now, so Applebloom picked a bald spot along the tree's surface, got into position, and with every bit of strength concentrated into her back legs, she kicked back against the tree. Her hooves made contact, and in that split second of impact, Applebloom suddenly felt as if the tree had told her its entire history. She felt the tree's textures and the age of the wood. The vibrations vibrating throughout her back legs and her entire body connected with the tree, and Applebloom suddenly felt like she could tell where each and every tree in the orchard was, their ages, how many apples each individual one had produced, and all of the ponies that had bucked them. It was a feeling Applebloom couldn't explain, and it felt as if time itself had stopped in that sudden moment, even though it was only a split second of time itself. The tree was strong and as sturdy as anything Applebloom could have imagined, and as soon as her hooves left the tree, reality manifested upon her gaze once more. She didn't dare look back, and waited for Applejack to say something instead, but silence only followed. She could only guess that meant she had to confirm it herself, so she turned to the tree, gulping hard, as she saw the result. 2 small imprints in the tree's surface, in the area she had chosen. A smile spread across Apple Bloom's face as she turned to her sister, also sharing a smile.
You're ready.
Apple Bloom would have followed with a burst of happiness, but that happiness was short-lived, feeling something grip her back legs and begin to drag her back towards the tree. Apple Bloom kicked and struggled to get free, yelling for Applejack to save her, but the mare only continued to smile and cry? Apple Bloom turned, only to see that the culprit for her sudden turmoil was the branches of the tree itself. Like sharp tendrils, they gripped at her limbs tightly, as she continued to plead for Applejack to help her, but the mare just stood in what seemed like a twisted happiness.
Don't fight it, Apple Bloom. It's all part of the initiation. You get to go through a cleansing.
Apple Bloom couldn't believe what she was hearing, continuing to fight the tendrils with her full might. But her strength faltered quickly, and the tendrils lifted her high from the ground. Her front and back legs were suspended, while another slinked into her mouth, holding her upper and lower jaw so that her mouth was wide open. Apple Bloom was unable to talk or even mutter a sound, as a much thinner twig slithered from her vision into her mouth and down her throat. Apple Bloom gagged and cried, feeling the thin tendril slither throughout her entire body. As it navigated her small body, a burning sensation followed it, feeling as if the areas the twig had successfully slithered through were on fire. She continued to cry and prayed to Celestia that whatever was happening was just a horrible nightmare and that Luna would wake her up any second. But the pain was too realistic to be a dream or a nightmare. The burning continued as she felt the twig slither, feeling as if a whole tree had sprouted in her body and was growing at a rapid pace, spreading through every limb and organ until it found either an exit or stopped on its own. It wasn't long before branches began to protrude from both her ear canals and anywhere else the branches could escape. Apple Bloom just continued to loathe in the agony, feeling that burning sensation everywhere, along with the hurt in her heart, staring at her sister with tear-filled eyes of terror. Finally, after what felt like forever to the young crusader, the branches stopped growing. The burning continued at a constant pace as she saw Applejack step forward, still holding that twisted smile. Apple Bloom tried to make some sort of remark, but the branches forbidded it.
I know it hurts, Sugar Cube, but just let it happen. It's all part of the initiation.
Apple Bloom could only look at her sister with terror as she continued to explain.
I know it all seems horrible right now, but trust me, it'll all be over faster than you think. Just like a butterfly, you're going to be put into a cocoon for a while. But don't worry, it's just like taking a nap. When you wake up, you'll be a whole new pony.
Suddenly, the branches that held Apple Bloom steady began to protrude what looked like white hairs, but it quickly became clear to Apple Bloom that she was being sealed in the cocoon Applejack had mentioned. She tried and struggled so hard to break free from her prison, but it was useless. She was trapped. She couldn't scream, plead, or yell for help as the hair-like material began to enclose her and protrude inside of her body. The hairs tickled the inside of her organs, making her feel like she was going to be sick. The hairs continued to grow and close around her, as Applejack said something that made her heart shatter.
I need to get back to Granny and Big Mick now. I can't wait to tell them the good news. I'll be checking in on you to make sure you're okay. For now, just close your eyes and sleep. When you wake up, you'll be back home safe and sound.
Apple Bloom could only stare in horror as her sister, the one who was supposed to protect her, left her to be entombed by the tree. She felt heartbroken and betrayed as she was lifted higher into the ancient tree by the branches. The hairs continued to grow inside of her as she closed her tear-filled eyes, feeling as if a moist ball of hair was choking her. The hairs escaped from her body as she watched in horror. The hairs extract a thick, sticky liquid colder than ice from their tendrils. The liquid burned her body like she was on fire, noticing that the liquid was solidifying, sealing her in it like one of those hard candies she had purchased from Ponyville's candy store. It took only seconds before she was sealed from head to hoof, and in an attempt to escape the horror, she closed her eyes. Applebloom's eyes peeked open, her eyes opening to a new sunny day. The aroma of freshly made pancakes filled the room as she took a moment to take in her surroundings. She was in her bed. She was in her room. She was alive. Her heart pounded in her chest, sweat coated her forehead, and her breaths rapidly cycled from the severity of the nightmare she had just experienced. She had been taken hostage by a tree, and Applejack had done nothing to stop it. But that's all it was. Just a terrible nightmare. Calming herself, Applebloom let out a relieved sigh, then got out of her bed. Her stomach grumbled at the scent of the pancakes as she combed her mane and adjusted her bow. With one last look in the mirror, Applebloom turned away and steadily made her way from her room to the kitchen. Present were the same company she saw every morning, her siblings and Grandmere. At the first sign of Applebloom's arrival, Applejack expressed a warm smile.
Looks like some pony slept well.
I guess you could say that.
Well, that's great to know, but best hustle your bustle, Sugar Cube.
What's the rush?
Well, Granny and I had a little chat last night, and we've decided that you are ready to start helping Big Mac and I on the far side of the orchard. You've grown up enough, and y'all are ready to take on the more tough trees.
Applebloom shuddered for just the slightest second. She thought back to the nightmare, the tree, the whore, the initiation. Had it all really been a nightmare? Was this sudden promotion just a complete coincidence? She thought hard and long for a few seconds until she was interrupted.
You okay, Sugar Cube?
Yeah. Just a little overwhelmed, I guess.
Well, I'm sure some pancakes and hard work will make all that go away.
With no other solution, Applebloom just replied with a nod of her head, then proceeded to eating pancakes with her family, awaiting her new job out in the orchard to come afterward.